everyone. This is Jackie. Okay, so if you're at a place where you've never heard of NDVI, NDRE, or any vegetative indice, awesome. Hopefully by the end of today's webinar, you'll at least be familiar with the terms and the various ways you can measure those. And if you have some experience with image overlays, which would come from a satellite, that's great. You're going to learn a little bit about some other ways to get information about your vineyard. Really cool. So I think we'll just go ahead and get started. We're a little bit early for time, but the great thing is that we do film and record all of these webinars. So you'll be able to go onto efficientvineyard.com and you can watch both today's webinar and the 2 past webinars that we have recorded thus far. And this is going to go on until the end of the project about this time next year. So we're going to have a lot of content for you. So feel free to watch those again or refer a friend if they weren't able to make it today. And I know in the next couple months, we're going to be getting into harvest time for everybody. So I know things are going to be really busy. So just feel free to use the website as a resource to keep up with the webinars, because we are presenting this information somewhat thematically. So we want the content to build on the previous webinars. So by the end, you'll kind of have a full curriculum of Precision Vit as we know it as part of the Efficient Vineyard project. So today we're gonna dive in and talk about photosynthesis, which it's a pretty cool reaction. So we're gonna dive into that a little bit. And then we're gonna talk about how photosynthesis produces energy and resources that the plant needs. So the source and sink relationship. We're going to spend a whole webinar on source and sink, also kind of terming that crop load. So we won't get into a lot of it today, but we're just going to sort of go over the basics. We're going to talk about a little bit about measuring vine size through leaf area measurements and pruning weight. So those are the more traditional ways to measure vine size in a vineyard, and then we are going to lead that into remote sensing and proximal sensing, and we will define what those mean. So if those terms don't mean anything to you, don't be scared, we'll get right into it. And then we're going to talk about how we validate the information that we get either remotely from satellites and aerial vehicles or proximal on the ground information. So we're going to talk about how to validate that with traditional measurements, and then Kevin's going to break down a little bit of the economics around some of the technology that we introduced today. Okay, so this might be familiar to you, photosynthesis, the basic equation. The crux of what we're really going to dive into today is the sunlight energy part, but basically the way I like to look at this chemical equation is you sort of have a brick and mortar situation on the left. So what the grape leaf is able to do, and specifically the chloroplast, which is what you're looking at on the right, is able to do is break up that brick and mortar in a really beautiful and delicate way so as to preserve each and every brick. So it's not just going in there like a jackhammer, but it's preserving every single brick in that wall that it gets. So that CO2 that comes in, the water, the H2O that comes in, it's breaking that up into its component parts and then rearranging those bricks in a way that provides food for itself. And it's using the sunlight's energy to harness that. It's harnessing the sun's energy to facilitate that process. And it's also producing oxygen, which we depend on to breathe. So pretty crucial photosynthesis to survival of both our beloved grapevines in our vineyard and also ourselves. So you could probably spend an entire semester just learning about photosynthesis and all of the complex processes that work within it. But what we really need to know is that there are 2 major components of photosynthesis. One of them is light dependent and one of them is light independent. So light reactions and dark reactions. So the light reactions, the pigments or the chlorophyll, and there's multiple kinds of chlorophyll. You can nerd out on that if you'd like, hit the Google. So chlorophyll is able to mine energy from the sun, and that's really important. And we're going to sort of develop that theme as this webinar goes through. So the chlorophyll pigments are harvesting the sun's energy in order to take those bricks apart. So taking H2O and splitting it. And that's creating the building blocks that can then be used to synthesize sugar and subsequently the rest of the different compounds that the grapevine needs to survive, especially perennially. So all of those light reactions are dependent on the sun's energy coming in. The dark reactions, those are light independent, and those are happening in the stroma, in the chloroplast there. So carbon from the air, which is abundant, there's lots of carbon dioxide floating around out there, more all the time, thanks to us. So the carbon dioxide from the air is fixed into the beginnings of sugar, which you see on the right-hand side of that equation. So photosynthesis is dependent on a lot of things. So sunlight is a major one. No sunlight, no photosynthesis. Water is the other big one. No water, no photosynthesis. Minerals in the soil, potassium and others are also important. We're not going to really dive into how those come into play, but they are important. Temperature is another thing that can influence photosynthesis. And again, we're not going to really dive into that, but too hot, photosynthesis will slow down or cease, and too cold, same deal. It'll slow down or completely stop. So this is the sun. You can thank it for your survival and the light and warmth on this earth. We're going to deal mostly with the light part. I know some people mentioned thermal imaging. We're not going to get into that today. We're going to pretty much stick with light. So this is the spectrum of solar radiation. The grayed out part is the part that the atmosphere blocks from reaching us here on Earth, and the part you can see in full color. That's the spectrum that's landing here or has potential to make contact with our grapevine canopies. So on the far left, you're seeing ultraviolet light. So those are smaller in wavelength, and just a refresher, wavelength is going to be the length from crest to crest of the wave. So on the left-hand side, that ultraviolet light, really short wavelengths, moving really fast. Then we move through the visible light spectrum. This is what gives our world color around us, and that's the part that's important in the photosynthetic process. We're going to get into that a little bit. And then moving to the right, we're getting into the infrared spectrum. And as you can see, I mean, that's taken up a lot of real estate in terms of wavelength. So the infrared spectrum is fairly large. Okay, so sun's shining down on Earth, solar radiation's coming through, and again, ultraviolet there is on the bottom, going all the way up to infrared on the top. And that's making contact with leaves. Now, our leaves are going to have what we call a spectral signature. So it's kind of like, it's a way that they reflect light that makes them unique, and we're able to know that that's a green leaf. So a healthy leaf, and we will get into why this is, reflects the most near-infrared light and the least blue and red light. So in that way, that's its spectral signature. It's always going to do that. A healthy leaf is going to have that relationship. As you move into stressed and dead leaves, those spectral signatures are going to change. A dead leaf is not going to have the same spectral signature as a healthy leaf, basically. Okay, so we'll get into actually why this happens and why these different wavelengths of light behave differently in terms of their reflectance. So this graph here is kind of just another way to visualize what we just saw. So your wavelengths on the bottom with the visible range on the left, moving into the near infrared and then into the further infrared range. So in the visible range, you're noticing that the little peak there that you're seeing is corresponding to green, whereas the lowest reflectance values are seen at the blue and red wavelengths. So that's actually why a grape leaf appears green to our eye, is because it's absorbing the most red and blue light and reflecting the most green light. And the reason that that's happening, going back to photosynthesis, and we mentioned that sunlight energy, it's really not that simple. It's not just the sunlight, it's actually specific wavelengths of the light that's coming from the sun, and they're doing different things. So those chlorophyll pigments, and as I mentioned, there's different chlorophylls. They harvest red and blue wavelengths of light for their energy. So very specifically the red and the blue wavelengths. And that's important, and we're going to use that throughout this webinar. So definitely remember that. The red and blue wavelengths are really important because those are being absorbed more than they're being reflected. Whereas the green, that's being reflected the most out of any of the wavelengths in the visible spectrum. So that's why our leaf appears green to the naked eye. So that's driven by photosynthesis, the relationship of reflectance in the visible spectrum. As we move into the near infrared spectrum, that's more dependent on the structures of the cells that make up the leaves themselves. So in the diagram there on the right, you see the palisade cells. Those are these kind of long cylinders, and they're allowing that near infrared light to pass through. And remember that near infrared light has longer wavelengths, right? Longer wavelengths, traveling more slowly. So those are kind of like your big roller waves. And so as you move down through the leaf, you're seeing that cellular structure is actually changing. So that spongy mesophyll there on the bottom, those cells really restrict how near infrared light travels. So the near infrared light, for the most part, will be reflected off of that spongy mesophyll layer and back out the top of the leaf. Some of it will be transmitted, but very, very little. And you're seeing that also in the values on the left-hand side. And I will just mention briefly, because it is used in some of the vegetative indices, and we'll discuss what those are as well, that red edge. The red edge is the transition between the visible and the near infrared spectrum. So as you're measuring reflectance in wavelengths moving from red to near infrared, you're going to see this really marked spike or boundary in reflectance. So that's what they term the red edge. Okay, so we know at this point, and I'm just going to repeat this probably over and over again so that it sticks with you, that red and blue are reflected the least. Near infrared is reflected the most. And the disparity between the reflection of red and near infrared is really high. You're seeing that marked slope there. So that's really important, and we're going to use that moving forward. Okay, so now that we know a little bit about the sun and the various spectra of light that it is shining on our grape leaves, and we know a little bit about photosynthesis. So our active, photosynthetically active leaf area is termed our source. So that's our source of energy that the plant can use for growth. So that's coming from the leaves. And the leaves themselves are actually a little bit of a sink because they're growing, so they need resources to fuel cell division and cellular respiration. But essentially, out of photosynthesis, you're getting basic sugar. So that's your primary food for the plant, and the plant can use it in a number of ways. First one would just be survival. Cellular respiration, we all do it. So survival takes energy, and the plant can get that by harvesting the energy from the sun, carbon dioxide from the air, and water from the soil, and makes its own food. Pretty awesome. So any sugar that is not immediately used for survival can be used as a building block for other types of energy nutrients, carbohydrates, amino acids, lipids, proteins, etc. And those are going to move in the vine. So the energy comes out of the leaves through photosynthesis, is transformed and transported to other tissues of the vine. So if you have ripening clusters, those are going to need some resources, primarily glucose and fructose. So those are going to be, the sugars in your ripe fruit. Your roots are going to need energy to keep growing, and your vegetative structures that are growing, your shoots, your leaves, depending on the time of the season, they're going to need a lot of energy as well. The perennial structures of your vine, the permanent structures, your trunks, your cordons, a lot of your roots, those are going to need resources as well. And then anything not immediately used for those things is going to be put in reserve a lot of the ways that humans accumulate fat in the body, so for a rainy day, it's there for when the vine needs it. So in the spring, that part is really important. Having those starch reserves really allows that spring growth to happen, because until the first few leaves on the shoot are more than half their size and they're able to produce more resources than they're demanding to grow, you're really depending on last year's storage reserves in order to grow. So that's a really important concept as well. Okay, so really basic source and sink there. So now we're going to get into a little gospel from Dr. Nelson Jawless. This is really the crux of where vineyard management comes in. So we've learned about the sun, we've learned about photosynthesis, and our goal as vineyard managers is to try to intercept as much sunlight as possible so that we have as much leaf area pumping out energy or food for the vine as possible. So in this picture, just in the chat box, Hop on in there and let me know which side of this picture do you think is intercepting more sunlight, the right side? And these are the same number of vines, I should also mention. Same number of vines, same area. Which side is intercepting more sunlight? Okay, one answer. There we go. Okay. Yep. All right, so it seems like the consensus is the left side. And I'd be curious, same height of trellis, same height of trellis. Everything really is constant besides the left-hand side is on what we call Geneva double curtain. So the canopy itself is actually split. And that would be equivalent in a VSP system to something like Scott Henry. So you have, you know, your upper and lower canopy. And in this case, you have kind of like a left and right canopy. And then we have single curtain on the right-hand side. So what Nelson was trying to do with this system was really show what the diagram on the left is showing. And I'm just going to read a little bit of his words because he's just got a great way of laying this all out really systematically. So in Nelson's words, the amount of carbohydrates produced by a grapevine is related to the total leaf area and to the rate of photosynthesis. Where the trellis is incompletely filled by a small vine, the viticultural problem is to produce more leaf area rather than to be concerned about the rate of photosynthesis. Where the trellis is filled or overfilled, there is no problem of leaf area production, but of rate of photosynthesis, because the overfilled trellis has interior leaves, and these are very inferior. Okay, and I'll follow that with something that's also pretty important for you to know, which is how much light is actually able to pass through that upper layer, that first layer that's in contact with the sun and into the interior layers of the canopy. So one grape leaf transmits so little, less than 10% of photosynthetically active radiation. Thus, it should be no surprise that the third and even the second layer of leaves, there is not enough light for normal rates of photosynthesis by those interior leaves. Okay, so what happens there is those red areas there, those internal layers, they're hurting. You know, then they're actually leaching energy from the plant and they're not producing anything because so little solar radiation is passing through the first layer of leaves to make it to the second. So you have a really large vine, right? Your vine size is high. You have a lot of leaf area. Your leaf area is high. Your canopy is full for sure. But in that sense, you have an excessive canopy fill. And in that way, you are not running an efficient vineyard. And we're all about efficient vineyards here. So Nelson's Jawless sort of passed the torch. Richard Smart was one of his grad students, and he published a book called Sunlight into Wine. Short read, but really informative. So if you haven't turned that page, just stick that one on the back of your toilet for a while. In it, you will find these diagrams talking about what can happen when you get into that red portion on the diagram on the previous slide. So you have some internal canopy shading, and those canes, those leaves, the buds, the clusters that are developing in that section of the canopy are going to be stunted. They're not producing resources. So all of, bud break is going to be depressed. Your bunch initiation, fruit set, and berry growth is going to be inhibited. So therefore, your fruit weight is going to be down per shoot, lower yields. You don't have that sink in the clusters for the nutrients because your yield is lower. So you're going to stimulate your shoot growth. You're going to get more vegetative growth and an imbalance between shoot and fruit growth. Higher canopy density, more leaf area, and you're stuck in this vicious vegetative cycle. On the right-hand side, this is really what we want to achieve. So balanced vines are going to produce enough foliage to mature their crop in the given season, to ripen off next year's fruiting wood, and to store sufficient starch to support the following season's initial growth. So we talked about that before. You know, you have to support these vines until they're able to kind of stand on their own 2 feet for a while. So in this cycle, we have fully exposed canopy, everybody's in the sunshine, everyone's happy, our fruit weight is going up, it's balanced with the amount of vegetative growth that we have, and we're filling our trellis but not overfilling our trellis. So in this way we're balanced and everybody's happy. And just to mention, in Sunlight into Wine, there's actually a, let's see if I can find it here. There's a wine grape canopy idiotype on page 28, and that reference is right on the bottom of the screen there for you. And you can actually go through and fill out your worksheet and rate your vineyard in terms of its efficiency, your canopy efficiency, and it'll kind of give you some ideas about how to manage excessive canopy or how to build vine size, which is really about water and nutrient management in the case of you where you have insufficient canopy fill, basically. All right. So some traditional ways to measure the source size. One of them is leaf area. So this measurement has been around for quite a long time. It's measured on a pretty small subset of shoots in the vineyard, and you can use a leaf area meter to run the leaves that you select through, and you're going to extrapolate that to a larger area of your vineyard. But not all the leaf area is exposed and functional, as we saw on the Nelson Jawless slide. So you can compare this with canopy density, which you can measure through PQA, something like that. There's lots of papers on that, or even sunlight interception through septometry or something like that, and get an idea about how much of your leaf area is really functional or exposed to the sun. And pruning weight, I mean, this one has been around way before Nelson Jawless. I mean, he has measured a lot of pruning weight in his day. The great thing about this, any one of you can do it. If you're pruning your vines, you can take pruning weights. You know, if you're hedging and that sort of thing, it's going to change the absolute number, but you're hedging the same way throughout a vineyard typically, so the relative pruning weights are still going to be an important measurement for you, and probably really provide more information than a lot of the sensing that we're going to talk about in the latter part of this webinar. So all your canes, weigh them, and you know how much vegetative growth you had in the year prior. So as you can see by these charts, pruning weight and leaf area, they're directly correlated. As one goes up, the other one goes up. So leaf area being somewhat cumbersome to measure and also being based on a small sample size. Pruning weight, you can measure every vine if you want to. It's your time, and typically in the dormant season, things are moving a little slower. You certainly don't have to do that. In a 10-acre vineyard, we may take 10 pruning weights on a research basis, so to get a good representation of what's going on. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to sensor validation. And you can also see as your vine size is going up, so pounds per vine, you're getting into higher yields, so you're able to ripen in those cases. So that's getting into the crop load, source, and sink relationship equation. So it is worth noting 3-pound vines, if we go back to the Nelson Jawless slide, that sort of area where it went to 100% canopy fill, 3-pound vines is when Nelson started to develop GDC to divide the canopy. So at that point, your vine size gets to a place where you're going to want to try to intercept a little bit more sunlight and maybe go to a divided canopy situation. So if you're dealing with over bigger divided canopy and read that Sunlight into Wine, it's really going to talk a lot about different trellising applications that might be able to help you intercept a little bit more sunlight. So now we're going to get into a little bit about remote sensing. So how do we know how full our canopy is? And if we're trying to rely on measurements of leaf area or pruning weight, where we're only going to take maybe a couple dozen of them tops, how do we get an idea of what's going on the vineyard scale? So this goes way back to the Landsat mission, which was first launched in 1972. And I think this sort of accidentally ended up tailoring to agriculture. These satellites were equipped with, in the first case, a multispectral scanner. And what that gave you was images of the Earth with specific information at 4 different bands, 2 of those in the near-infrared, green and red. And so then scientists were working on, okay, how do we use that information to classify what's going on Earth? So that was kind of the origins of something called NDVI, which we're going to get. we're going to get to moving forward. And as we move toward the present, you're going to see that those wave bands get more narrow and there's more of them. And each of those wave bands is going to give us information that's, you know, not only useful for agriculture, but for other things, but really just increasing the resolution of the information we're getting from satellite-based data. And if you remember back to the first webinar about resolution, how important it is. So Landsat was the first, but now there is a whole constellation of satellites up there offering all sorts of imagery, and some of these are commercial, some of them are owned by government agencies, but these all are available for civilians to get imagery by purchase. Some of it's free to be able to download of your vineyard. What you get into with satellites is the resolution issue, but there's a lot of them. And so this is basically what one of those images would look like. So this is just with a 4-band with near-infrared, red RGB. And so normalized difference vegetation index was a way to make sense of this image, a way to convert it into something that would allow us to see patterns in the vineyard. So something like this. And going back to the beginning of our webinar, we're using the spectral signature of healthy leaves to find where there's more of them. So to find where we have more exposed leaf area, also called photosynthetically active biomass, whatever term you want to use, where you're intercepting more sunlight, basically, you're going to have a higher NDVI. Where you're intercepting less sunlight, you're going to have a lower NDVI. One limitation of this is that it's only seeing what's exposed to either the camera, if it's flown, or satellite-based, or on a UAV, or, you know, people call them drones. You're only able to see what the sensor is exposed to. So in this case, it's just exposed leaf area. So NDVI is basically using the various information at the different wave bands to come up with one informative number that's going to allow you to make sense of the spatial patterns in your vineyard. And so another way to think about it, so if you're looking at Landsat 1, you have information from the entire wave band here going into your normalized difference vegetation index, or your NDVI. So the resolution from a Landsat 1 image is actually pretty poor, right? I mean, you're covering quite a bit in terms of wavelength. You're not really targeting the actual low point of reflectance or the actual high point of reflectance in the near infrared. So that's just important to consider when you're thinking about resolution of imagery. Obviously that's Landsat 1. So as we move forward in time, you know, that would be your red reflectance in that wavelength. So you have a value there, right? And then you go to your near infrared and you have a value of your reflectance there, depending on what wavelengths your imagery is sensitive to. So you have a value there. So the difference between the red reflectance and the near infrared, so that's going to be your numerator there, the difference between those two values. Moving forward, you're going to add your reflectance to your near infrared reflectance. So your red and your near infrared. So the sum of those two, that's going to be your denominator. So that's basically NDVI in a nutshell. It's just using the spectral signature of a healthy leaf in order to determine if it's there or not. And this, from the Landsat perspective, was really used to just identify vegetation with respect to water or buildings and just differentiate land use. That's really what this was designed to do. And it's been adapted and used in agriculture probably for the, the last 40 plus years now. And so moving through history of the Landsat launches, you're increasing your resolution. So we have ultra blue, we have green, red, and those are narrower wavelengths now. Near infrared and the shortwave near infrareds, panochromatic, and then we have the cirrus and some that I couldn't even fit. And because of that, the more wavelengths that they're adding, they've come up with, I mean, there's probably hundreds at this point of what they call VIs, so vegetation indices, and they're used for various different things. So your vendor who's flying your vineyard, whether it's UAV or they're getting remote sense imagery from a satellite, NDVI is not the only thing you can calculate. And we're not going to dive into a lot of these, but just know that there are plenty of them out there. And I mean, this is just a short list. There's a lot out there, and they have different strengths and weaknesses, but you should know that not every map you get is NDVI, that they do sometimes represent different indices using different wavelengths. So they're going to have a little bit different meaning there. So we'll get in now to a little bit of ways that you can measure these different spectral reflectance values. So in this airplane, you can see on the bottom, there's a little hollowed out spot where you can put a lot of different sensors, cameras, you know, someone mentioned thermal imaging. It can all be mounted right to this airplane, and large areas can be flown at a time. Because you're closer to the Earth, you're able to get a lot higher resolution than from a satellite imagery. Satellites also are orbiting the Earth, so there's a restriction on how often they can revisit the same site. So if you want to look at development of your crop throughout a growing season, or your canopy throughout a growing season, then you're going to want to be able to revisit it when it's convenient for you. So obviously a plane, you can fly it whenever you want, and these can carry a pretty high payload capacity. So you can get into some pretty sophisticated sensors that need heavy batteries or a lot of power to run. You can fly for a pretty long time. So you have a lot of flexibility there, and your storage capacity for data is really high. Some disadvantages, you do have to work with the FAA here. So you have to, you know, work with air traffic control and plan a flight and get a pilot and rent a plane, or, you know, hire a service done by a photogrammetry company. You do have multiple images, so you have to mosaic them in a way that makes sense. And if you don't have ground control, that can be a little bit different, a little bit more difficult, but most of the vendors will take care of all that for you. And it can be cost inhibited for smaller fields. I mean, jet fuel is not getting any cheaper anytime soon. So one thing that's emerged, and it's getting a lot of headlines, a lot of people are really interested in the UAV imaging, or the slang term is drone, because they sound like bees, I guess. The advantage to this, again, is the flexibility of how high you can fly over the canopy is really high. So you can get fantastic resolution with cameras mounted to unmanned aerial vehicles. It's a shorter flight time. I mean, you can do a 5-acre vineyard in 2 minutes, depending on your flight pattern. I mean, it doesn't take much time. Probably takes longer to get it there, set it up, than it does to get it in the air. One thing I should have put on under disadvantages, if this is something you'd like to get into yourself, you do need a pilot's license. It's an online class. I've heard it doesn't take very long, but that is a hoop that you'll have to jump through if this is something that you want to start to integrate yourself. These, depending on how much you want to invest in a UAV, they can't carry that heavy of a load. So you are going to need to work with things that are a little bit lighter than something you could mount on an airplane. Restricted power delivery, you're limited in your flight time by how much battery power you have, and batteries are pretty heavy. So if you want to run a more sophisticated sensor for a long time, you know, you're limited there. There's so many images. The closer you get to the canopy, the more images you're going to have to stitch together. So that's just sort of a data processing load. Again, vendors are going to take care of that for you. There's a lot of apps out there that'll do that for you. Here, what I notice is the market for UAVs is really flooded, and there's quite a spectrum of cameras that are available, how good they are, you know, the UAVs themselves, how much they cost, the quality of how the data is processed. So depending on who you use as a vendor or what you purchase, the quality of the map you're going to get in the end, or the data that you're going to get in the end, varies really widely. So it's hard to know how much to pay for this type of service if you're not really familiar with what sort of data is coming out of these systems. So just to kind of drive that point home, in the chat box, I would like to ask everyone what color this person's shirt is. Can anyone give me that information? Gray. Yeah. Yeah, you don't know, do you? I mean, this is a black and white image. You can't just put color in it if you don't start with it. So I think that's the best way that I can explain that you can't necessarily extract NDVI. You can't at all, actually. It's impossible to extract near-infrared from a camera that's only capable of sensing in the visible range, or an RGB camera. There's no near-infrared information. So those people that are hiring services to come and fly their vineyards and give them NDVI, a vendor can put a legend on anything they want. You can get patterns from even just the red band, and it'll look like something, but is it NDVI? I don't know. So I think it was pink, by the way. So I think it's important just to remember that near infrared piece is only available from a camera that can sense reflectance in that wavelength. You can't add it after the fact. So just a really important thing to know if you're going out there in the consumer world and trying to hire this as a service. So as part of the Efficient Vineyard project, most of our experience has been with proximal sensing. We have our reasons for this. One of them is, especially in East Coast viticulture, we're driving a tractor through our vineyard fairly often. I mean, we're applying multiple sprays for a year. A lot of people are employing a sod row middle or some type of cover crop that either needs to be mowed or rolled crimped or seeded or whatever. So we're running through the vineyard, and these sensors are very easy to just slap on the front of a tractor and push one button and let them go. And they just collect their data while you're doing what you normally would be doing in a vineyard. So we don't need a special trip. They're very easy to use. And the other advantage is that this is what we're looking at. So we're able to sense the area of the canopy that's actively growing and that is varying. So another thing I want to get into a little bit is the difference between a passive and an active sensor. So an image coming from a satellite, from a camera mounted onto a plane or an unmanned aerial vehicle, that is a passive sensor. So a passive sensor is using just the sun's light reflecting off at certain wavelengths. And those wavelengths, the spectra that they are sensitive to are fairly wide. Whereas active sensors, they have silicon photodiodes on them, and those are sensitive at very specific wavelengths. So 670 nanometers is the exact point where red reflectance off of a grapevine canopy is minimized. And then it's grabbing near infrared, which is where it's maximized. And then the 730 nanometers is that apex of the red edge part. And that's used for something called NDRE, which is the normalized difference red edge. So that's just a different vegetative indice that you can use. Like I said, there's quite a bit of them out there. So just important to know that there are different sensors out there. And just to go a little bit into that more, the image-derived spectral reflectance values. So those are the ratio of the near-infrared and the red pixel values. So those are different than getting the actual reflectance that's internally calibrated to its own light source. So this has the polychromatic LED display. It has its own light source that's hitting the vine, and the reflectance is calibrated to that display. So you're not just getting a pixel value, you're getting an actual reflectance number. And this sensor spits that out into a data collector that's tied in with GPS. So you're able to get the actual reflectance at 3 different wavelengths. Because of that, you can calculate a whole bunch of vegetative indices. So you're not limited to NDVI. If you want to use something else, you certainly can do that. But unlike a passive sensor, you're getting high resolution, really good information. And a passive sensor is just going to be a little more coarse than that, because as you saw on the previous slides, your waveband spectra, it's a range. It's not a value. So because the reflectance is going to vary in that wavelength, in that spectrum, the NDVI value that you get is just going to have a little bit more error in it. If all you're looking for is just the pattern in your vineyard, passive and active can both give you enough information to go in and validate with. So we're looking here at 3 different, let's call it just like a field of view, right? So we're looking at 3 different fields of view. One of them is a little bit sparse. As you can see, less light interception is going on the left side than the far right. And in the middle, we're intercepting a lot of sunlight there, but there's not a lot of internal shading. There aren't a lot of leaf layers that are stacked on top of each other, whereas our exposed leaf area might be similar, but we're going to have some internal canopy shading going on the right-hand side. So this is essentially what a map would look like of the proximal sensors that we use. So we run them through the vineyard. Usually we're driving every other row, just depending. And we're able to see that areas where there's less exposed leaf area or less canopy fill, we represent those in red. So the corresponding NDVI values for the red areas are going to be lower. So the near-infrared, the difference between the near-infrared, the ratio between the difference between near-infrared and the sum of the near-infrared and red reflectance, that's going to be lower. Moving into the higher NDVIs, we're going to look at those green areas being somewhat in the middle and the blue areas being where your canopy is the most full. Now, we can't tell you how much photosynthesis you're doing, how efficient your canopy is, what your vine size is in absolute numbers, whether that's leaf area or pruning weight. We're not able to tell you those absolute numbers with these proximal sensors, but what we are able to do is give you a map which you can then use to go out and get that information yourself. So this is just, I just want to mention this briefly. When you're working with a system that you are imaging from above the vine, if you have a cover crop, if it's grass, if it's actually a dedicated cover crop mix, or if it's bare soil, those reflectance values are going to throw off your bi-pixel NDVI values if they're not removed in the process. So you can characterize bare soil by having relatively low near-infrared reflectance and relatively high red reflectance. So it is possible to remove those mixed pixels, they call them, but not every vendor does this. So it's just something to be wary of, and maybe a question to ask, like, how do you deal with the data from this? And are you able to remove cover crop and bare soil from the map, or are you giving me just the entire pixel? Because it will impact your final image. So just something to note there. If you're using a proximal system, you don't really have to worry about that because you're pointing just at the area of interest. So right now, we can give you a relative pattern, and you can go out and take some targeted leaf area or pruning weight measurements and translate that map. So we can tell you, you have more exposed leaf area here and less here, and you can go out and say, okay, in my areas of more exposed leaf area, I have 2.5 pound vines. In my areas of less exposed leaf area, I have 1/2 pound vines. And you can characterize the patterns absolutely in that way. But wouldn't it be nice if we had actual exposed leaf area measurements? So our colleagues at Carnegie Mellon University, we're going to deal with this technology in some webinars exclusively, but they're developing a tool that will actually be able to estimate that based on RGB images taken proximally in the vineyard. So this is kind of like the prototype and the technology out on the horizon. But in the meantime, we are able to translate maps via this method. So we get an NDVI map, we target some samples. So you can see over on the right, we're giving the growers rows to go take pruning weights in. And then we're able to look at the relationship between those absolute numbers, those pruning weights that we got, and their corresponding NDVI values from the proximal sensors. And we're able to use that variation to translate the NDVI map. So rather than having the legend of the NDVI there, that ratio, we could actually give them essentially the same map, same image, but instead of NDVI, it would have pruning weight or leaf area or some other metric that they want to go out and measure to actually quantify the absolute numbers that go with those patterns. So yeah, the maps just tell you, I'm just answering, someone popped in the chat box here. So the maps are essentially telling you in the field of view that the sensor can see where there's more green and where there's less green in that little square, right? And we just have, we have thousands of data points in each vineyard that we're able to, and we're going to go through how we take the data out of these sensors and make a map from it. So you are going to get that whole thing. We'll walk you through that. But yeah, this just tells you relatively where you have more canopy and where you have less. And then it's your job as a vineyard manager to go out and say, okay, what does that mean? What does that mean in my vineyard? And then this is another good thing to mention, and I see that Terry is addressing this as well. The NDVI sensors do kind of have like an upper limit. If this picture had no blue sky at all, and it was just a mass of green, you're going to get to a point where your NDVI value is so close to 1. And if that's your whole vineyard, or if the sensor is not placed properly and that's all you're seeing is just a mass of green, it's going to have a harder time characterizing any variation there. And this is something I see too. I mean, if you get a map from a vendor and the legend just says high vigor, low vigor, and you don't even know the NDVI values, it's very hard for you to know if that signal is saturated or not, or how much soil or cover crop is coming into play there. So anyway, relative patterns to absolute patterns are reliant on boots on the ground and manual sampling, but the NDVI can give you the relative patterns. And as you saw, there's various ways to do that via satellite, UAV, aerial imagery, or proximal sensing. So Kevin's gonna talk a little bit now about what that might cost.
I just want to make sure you guys can all hear me. It does sound like I sound pretty good. Good to be with you today. And I do want to touch on sort of the different methods of gathering this data and what those costs would be associated with that. And there's going to be really two different ways that we look at those costs depending on what the methodology is. So this is the type of data logger that we might use. You can see pictured on your right. The acquisition cost for one of those packages might be in the neighborhood of $8,000 to $9,000 for the crop circle that we're working with. Ag Leader and other vendors offer similar technology. Their sensors may not measure exactly the same type may not produce the same type of data, but it is relatively close in terms of the raw data that it gathers. They're certainly a little bit more commercially available and potentially a little bit more robust from the perspective of a large grower trying to implement the technology with maybe a less skilled operator. So when you go from a crop circle of a cost of $8,000 to $9,000 for a complete package, an Ag Leader system would be $9,500 to $11,000. Most of that cost for an Ag Leader type system is going to be the tractor computer and GPS. And I mention that because for a lot of the functions of using this data to actually change what you're doing in the vineyard, you're going to end up buying that equipment anyway. So for some, it may represent actually a lower cost depending on what your applications are, particularly with large growers. What that produces, for example, with a crop circle, is basically a comma-separated file. It's not particularly useful on its own. It's great from the perspective that it really doesn't create a lot of data, even though you have a lot of sample points. You have a ton of data. It's very efficient in the way it's stored. But what that means is georeferencing is going to cost more than maybe some of the other types of imagery that are available. So it's going to be free to project participants in the Lake Erie region. The extension program has been doing this for a while now on a pretty small scale as we try to help growers get familiar with this technology and see what we have from an economic perspective in terms of variability in vine size and other variation. We want to use this technology in commercial vineyards, so it's been free. So we have some project goals of making this more accessible and allowing growers, either a farmer owner who's interested in learning, a manager or someone that they hire, the ability to start doing this georeferencing with tools that are developed by the project. And if those tools get developed and they're implemented successfully, I could certainly see where it would be $10 to $30 per block or $2 to $6 per acre for that image and that data to be georeferenced. Now, in terms of what those costs actually represent, in a lot of cases, it would end up being unpaid labor. So it's just going to take time on the part of the owner or an employee to get that done. So maybe paid labor, unpaid labor. An Ag Leader type system, they're going to do some data processing, certainly the georeferencing, and it's essentially included in the software package that is listed above. One of the things they really like to link this information to is soil health and what you can do to help your soil to help your NDVI readings. It's one of the things that a lot of consultants like to do, and in some cases it's a really important element. In some cases it's not actually what's driving what the problem is, but that service is available and it would be $9 to $15 per acre. So essentially you're using some of this NDVI data and other sensor data to help dictate what your nutrient management plan is going to be. And they'll basically provide those services in that price range. In the Lake Erie region, it's going to be closer to $9. In the Hudson Valley, it's going to be closer to 15 or 16, and I'm not exactly sure what that price is in California. I do know the services are available, and I would think that they would be somewhat comparable. Image processing. So all we really did with georeferencing is take that data and show you where that data is on a map. But there's some further processing, and Jackie touched on this, in terms of trying to make the data more useful. Ag Leader includes some of this data processing with SMS Advanced, which is included in that price above, but we're not necessarily sure. The project hasn't actually really ground truth that processing. It's a much more simplified process. So it's probably definitely going to work when there's a lot of variability, but it's certainly not going to work in all cases. And you'll see with the other methods of gathering data that they rely on what Ag Leader is doing and methods that Ag Leader is using, more so than the kriging and the data trimming that's sort of manually done by our program. And in those cases, we're looking at probably $30 per acre or more if you could find the available labor and skill to do that. So the project goal is to reduce that by at least 50%. The system that the project is working on developing would really reduce the expertise required in that process, and in doing so would make it more commercially available to an average grower. So what I refer to as vertical spectral imaging, this is where a lot of the excitement is. There was a study in 2015, which is sort of important to note because these costs are going to change all the time. Satellite technology is advancing. UAV technology, especially in terms of battery life, is advancing. So these costs will evolve, and I'm sure they've evolved since 2015. But looking at what this project showed, a satellite imagery was available for about $2,650 in total cost. So the image was processed, it was georeferenced. To put that in context, that was an image of a 120-acre block or a 5-acre block. The satellite really doesn't care because it covers such a wide ground. Now, if you get up to say 1,000 or 1,500 acres, you're certainly going to start dealing with multiple images. But that's for one image. So with NDVI, when we have a grower that owns their own sensor, they might be taking 5 or 6 rounds of images per year with thousands of images per acre. So obviously the processing cost is going to be higher, but that's where satellite has a relative advantage in some sense. Aircraft, again, around $3,800 for a single image. So you'd be looking at spending about $3,800 per year for 120 acres. That cost would, of course, go down slightly as your farm got smaller and go up slightly as it got larger. But really the largest cost is, you're getting an aircraft into the air. So it's pretty linear. With a UAV, a cost of $5,300 for acquisition, georeferencing, and image processing. Here you'll see a much more pronounced change in price in this situation and in this example when your farm starts changing in size, because it does take much longer than an aircraft or a satellite, obviously, in terms of man hours to actually get that imagery and gather that data. In 2015, it was assumed that this would be done by a consultant. So that makes complete sense with a satellite. A grower is not going to go put their own satellite up in the air, although we might be getting there in the next 10 years. We're certainly not there yet. The aircraft will probably never get there. That's always going to be a consultant. And the UAV, where we are certainly drifting towards a state where we could see growers certainly purchasing UAVs and sensors. But again, just like the crop circle, the georeferencing and image processing can be a bit of a challenge. The Ag Leader technology can help to a certain extent, and if we get our tools, we could as well. So with the UAV cost, in that price, that would be per image. But obviously you could see those costs changing a lot when you shifted it to a grower-owned UAV. Crop circle, trying to put that $10,000, $15,000 cost into some context. The acquisition cost of that $10,000 on a 120-acre farm would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $100 because you'd be using it multiple times. You're not buying a new crop circle every time you take some imagery. Georeferencing and image processing is going to be relatively expensive per image right now, and that's somewhat estimated, but most of the growers that are large enough to be doing this on their own are hiring employees that can handle georeferencing and image processing on their own. So they're getting people with degrees in this field. So it's relatively expensive. $30 to $50 an hour is probably a pretty aggressive estimate. It could cost more than that.
Oh, are you ready?
Yeah, so I wanted to make this as efficient as I could. I think most of what our audience is looking for is the actual cost of what it takes to get involved, to take these sensors and purchase them for themselves. I think we'll get into the benefits a little later on as we talk about individual practices. So this is kind of like, a test for cancer. You don't actually benefit by the test at all. So when we get into the actual treatments and what we can do with this in terms of affecting vine size and yield, then we'll get there.
Okay, more information on Crop Circle. Quick question that just came in. HollandScientific.com. We will post that link below the recorded version of the webinar on efficientvineyard.com if anyone wants more information, along with all of our references, and links to those will be below the recorded version as well. Just give us a day or two to get that up there. If any of you have to pop off right now, go for it. I know everybody's busy. I wanted to give Terry a minute because it looks like he might still be answering a question in the chat box. So I don't want to end the meeting. So in this time, I will just mention that this webinar was designed to introduce you to the theory behind how NDVI or spectral reflectance sensing works, the various platforms that you can get the information. And we're going to move into how to use that information in vineyard practices ranging from crop estimation to shoot thinning to adjusting crop through fruit thinning. So there are a lot of ways that you can put these type of maps to work for you in the vineyard, and we are going to dive into that in the course of this webinar series. So if this has kind of left you just really curious, like, okay, so what do I do with this? Good. We're definitely going to get there, and we're going to cover that. And we haven't released a full schedule of topics that we're going to cover. We do have a theme in mind, but please reach out to us via email on the Efficient Vineyard site. You can even just comment on the YouTube version of these webinars. If there are questions that you have or topics that you want covered or situations you've run into that you think if we could address those, it would kind of help the good of the order in the precision viticulture world, please let us know. We're designing these webinars to help you out and to kind of give you a base for a lot of this technology and allow it to make a little bit more sense to you. So feel free to help guide the conversation. And hopefully we've reached an answer. Are any growers you know of using the crop circle imaging systems? Definitely. In the Lake Erie region where we are based, where we're broadcasting from, several owners own their own sensors, and Crop Circle, I think, gave licensing over to, they produce it, it would be my guess because it's the exact same machine, and it's labeled the Optrix, and you can buy that through Ag Leader. So Ag Leader will sell you a Crop Circle sensor that is designed to integrate with their field computer and their GPS units. And it measures the same thing that the Crop Circle measures. But the advantage to purchasing a Crop Circle from Holland Scientific directly is that you're able to get those 3 reflectance values. I think for simplicity, Ag Leader just locks you into NDVI and you're stuck with it. I don't really understand it because the information's there, and I don't know why they wouldn't just give you all the information. But if you do get a Crop Circle directly from Holland Scientific, you'll have those 3 reflectance values. And again, that's an active sensor with its own light source and internal calibration. So the reflectance values you get are like the center of the dartboard, man. They're right there. So we really like those sensors. You can mount those on a drone. I've seen that as well if you want to do something from the air. But I don't know of any vendors in the precision viticulture space that are offering active UAV sensing. It's all passive, and oftentimes it's just an RGB image, and maybe they tell you it's NDVI, but as we saw with the lady in the pink shirt, it's not, and it never will be. So I think that's just sort of one of the things that happens when there's a lot of vendors popping up in a space that's not fully understood, I guess. So the intention of this webinar was just to give you enough information. Yeah, there's Green Seeker as well. That's Trimble's reflectance sensor. So there are multiple ones out there. And if you hit our website, we do have a lot of information on that as well. Any technology developed or being developed that can tell you how well you're doing efficiency in capturing sunlight in your canopy? Well, in that case, you know, this is something we'll get into, but as I mentioned with the stratified sampling, if you want to know how efficient your canopy is, you know, take those relative patterns and go to the high, medium, and low areas and take a septometer reading, or even just PQA, which is, you know, go to YouTube. If you don't know how to do a PQA, type it in YouTube. You'll get somebody there. It'll walk you through the tutorial. It's pretty easy. And that'll just give you like the number of leaf layers. And if you go into sunlight into wine, you'll see that Richard Smart recommends 1.5 leaf layers in his ideal canopy. So there are tools out there that can give you efficiency. And if you really want to get into it and do a whole pressure bomb thing, you can do that as well. But that's more of a researcher realm. So I would say use the NDVI to give you the relative patterns and direct you to the places in your vineyard where you need to take a closer look scouting. And even just by eye, you can see a lot if you know where to go. And the nice part about what we do for our growers as part of our loaner sensor program is we give them a KMZ file that they can patch right into Google Earth and walk around with their cell phone in their hand, and their little blue dot is telling them exactly where they are in the vineyard. I'm not sure what vendors offer that as part of their imaging service. It's really not that hard. But if you get a crop circle sensor and you collect information and you need help with it, processing it, or getting a KMZ, we're here to help you. So just contact us and we'll guide you as best we can. So if anyone has follow-up questions, we ran a little bit over, so I just want to cut this off for those of us that have busy lives or vineyard management to get back to. So shoot us an email, shoot us a comment on the recorded version, and we'll be sure to answer your questions. And yeah, I think with that, we'll wrap it up and just thank you all for your time.
Thanks a lot.
See you next month.